Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Robert Conti, here with Senator Whitehouse and Phil West, neither of whom needs any introduction to this crowd. And we have on the telephone by conference call former Governor Lincoln Almond. The Providence mayoral election raises the alarming prospect of allowing someone who has been convicted of serious felonies while in office, not once but twice, to return to City Hall. The voters of the city of Providence are the ones who will decide whether the conduct that gave rise to... Yes?
I'm sorry, I kept hanging up on you.
Okay, we're just getting started. The voters of the city of Providence are the ones who will decide whether the conduct that gave rise to Mr. Cianci's criminal convictions render him unfit to hold this important office again. Some voters have made up their minds, but many have not. Many voters were not in Providence or not of voting age when some of these events took place. That's why Senator Whitehouse, former Governor Almond, and I, as former federal prosecutors, have decided to speak up. Throughout this campaign, and even before, Mr. Cianci has relentlessly minimized and even joked about the crimes that he committed while in office. As people who served in the office of the U.S. Attorney for Rhode Island and saw firsthand what went on, we felt it was critical to correct the record and to make clear to the voters what Mr. Cianci was convicted of, so that they will be better able to decide if he is fit to be mayor for a third time. Let's look first at the record of what Mr. Cianci actually did. During his first administration, Mr. Cianci pleaded guilty in state court to a violent beating involving a fireplace log and an ashtray, among other implements. And also, during this first administration, the president of the city council repeatedly complained to then U.S. Attorney Almond that Cianci was killing the city, that the city couldn't get anything done because of the payoffs and the kickbacks demanded by the mayor. Even before his second term began, multiple senior members of his administration were charged and convicted in federal and state courts. Mr. Cianci's second administration gave rise to the Plunder Dome investigation by the FBI. After a lengthy trial, a jury convicted Mr. Cianci of a RICO conspiracy, in effect, of running Providence City Hall as a criminal racketeering enterprise for the better part of a decade. His conviction was upheld by the federal judge who presided over the trial and by the First Circuit Court of Appeals. Mr. Cianci has repeatedly dismissed this as some kind of technicality, even going so far as to describe it as some guy down the hall who took a G note. That, quite frankly, is an outrageous mischaracterization of the case. A couple of observations from the Court of Appeals opinion really capture what Mr. Cianci was convicted of doing. The Court of Appeals said, Cianci and his chief of administration were shown to have used their positions and influence to sell municipal favors on a continuing basis. The Court of Appeals said there was detailed evidence placing Cianci in the middle of several of the racketeering acts. And the Court of Appeals said the defendants and Cianci were the beneficiaries of most, if not all, of the 9 schemes, designed to line Cianci's pockets as well as to maintain his political power. I would also note that one of the major goals and concerns of our justice system is rehabilitation. In sentencing and in many other ways, we look to see whether a defendant has learned a lesson from his or her conduct and to see whether or not the defendant has accepted responsibility and shown real remorse for the criminal behavior. Despite his repeated claims that he has changed and that he is now a different person, the record in Mr. Cianci's case shows the exact opposite. After his first conviction, he made the exact same claims and then came back to preside over the RICO conspiracy for 8 years. And even after the second conviction, incredibly, he has done nothing but to make light of what he did. He jokes repeatedly that he lived in a gated community. In his book, he openly admits that he used city jobs as currency, that he rewarded his friends and supporters, and that he punished his political enemies. and stated, quote, "You can't buy your enemies, but you can rent them. It was all a big joke." Mr. Cianci has shown no remorse and no sign of rehabilitation. There is every reason to believe that if he returns to City Hall, he will do the same thing again for a third time. In a very real sense, the voters are being asked to hire someone to run the city of Providence. Think of it this way. If you owned a small business and you hired John Smith as president, he then commits a felony and is fired, comes back years later and tells you he's changed and he's learned his lesson, so you give him a second chance and rehire him. And he responds by turning your company into a racketeering conspiracy, demanding and collecting bribes and kickbacks. He is arrested and sent to prison. Would you hire him a third time? Not in a million years. That's what this election is all about, and that is really why we are here today. In my view, this is one of those moments that really transcends partisan politics, and so I join with my colleagues from the U.S. Attorney's Office, Senator Whitehouse and former Governor Almond, in urging the voters of the city to think long and hard about the serious consequences of a third Cianci administration. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Bob. The investigation that ultimately became the Plunder Dome trial began on my watch. And I want to augment what U.S. Attorney Parenti has said about the efforts by Mr. Cianci to minimize or downplay the extent of his conduct and criminal activity. To put this in context, a United States attorney is not allowed to start a criminal investigation against a public official, nor will the FBI participate in such an investigation if there is not predication, which is the legal term for evidence to provide a reasonable basis for believing that the subject of the investigation either has engaged in, is engaged in, or is likely to engage in the criminal conduct that's being investigated. So this is not an investigation that began without evidence. It began with evidence adequate to allow the FBI and the Department of Justice to sign off on this investigation because the predication was adequate. Later down the road, the government had the opportunity to file additional evidence related to criminal misconduct by Mr. Cianci in the context of what might be used at trial, particularly with regard to cross-examination of Mr. Cianci. There is a rule that distinguishes between just general prior bad acts evidence, which is not admissible, it's only designed to prejudice the defendant, and prior bad acts that are related to the conduct or would tend to prove preparation, plan, intent, and other relevant elements of the case. The government made that filing before the trial. The mayor was convicted, I want to say, on June 24th, and shortly thereafter, the court released the 404B document, and on July 3rd, 2002, Tracy Bretman Tomboni of the Providence Journal wrote a fairly lengthy article about it, which is, I think, the clearest public record of it that we have. My second point is that one should not believe that this type of criminal activity is harmless to individual constituents and taxpayers of a city. The bribes that are paid by contractors have to be built into bids and end up coming out of taxpayers' pockets. And the danger that a businessman may face that he will be subject to threats, bribery, extortion, and so forth have a very obvious discouraging effect on doing business there. That has been proven by the surge of activity that followed Mayor Cianci's tenure. think Mayor Cicilline is a good witness as to the, I want to say it's over $1 billion in activity that surged into the city of Providence once Mayor Cianci was removed from office. Those were the 2 points I wanted to make. Thank you, Attorney Correnti, and now we can turn to my predecessor, Lincoln Almond.
Okay, Mrs. Almond,
Yes.
if former Governor Almond is there with you, if he's able to hear, if he could add his remarks, that would be wonderful.
Okay, just a second.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start off just by talking about the fact that the mayor has said he makes mistakes, but unfortunately, he has no apology for the people of the city of Providence for what he did. He makes all kinds of excuses. He talks about technical violations, and of course, this was not a technical violation. When the jury found him guilty of the conspiracy, they basically swept the board of all the offenses. I can't speak for the jury, but that was the major count. And I think when individuals look at what he's got to say about the conviction, we have to look at what the judge had to say, the sentencing judge. First of all, he got 5 years in prison. And you don't get 5 years in federal prison for a technical violation. You get 5 years in prison under the sentencing guidelines for a major violation. The judge also found, and keep in mind that the judge sat through this entire trial, listened to all the evidence, and he found that Cianci was running a criminal enterprise from City Hall. And I can tell you that in my judgment, that criminal enterprise goes from the day that Cianci took office until the day he left office in his second term. And I think he owes an extreme apology to the people of Providence. And I think if you look at the extent of the corruption and the length of the corruption, I think his promises to be good in the future ring hollow. I think the other issue is the fiscal issue facing the city of Providence. Obviously, the city has some real fiscal problems, and those were created during the Cianci administration. And I think that the people to elect him, the individual who created the problem, the major problem in the city of Providence, and keep in mind this problem has a heavy impact on the educational system in the city of Providence and on early education, which I've always been very high on. And I think that people ought to just take a look at what's happening or going to happen to the city of Providence if you go back to the old ways of managing the city of Providence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Governor. Phil?
I really don't have much to add. I think this is so important that the three of you as U.S. attorneys have come together to make this decisive statement. I think the real question for the press and for the people of Rhode Island, particularly the people of Providence, is, has Buddy Cianci's character changed? I don't see any evidence that it has. When he claims that he would come back and would run the city in a different or a better way than he did before, I find that hard to believe. The only way that he knows how to run a city is pay to play. The reason that he has gotten such support from so many people is because they are afraid of what will happen to them unless he's reelected. So people who are in the city now and who are giving to him, I think their motives are questionable. I don't want to make a big deal of it. Senator Whitehouse mentioned the document that the U.S. Attorney's Office was ready to file that laid out, at the end of this 2002 trial, that laid out all the things that had occurred previously. It's an astonishing list. It hasn't been proven in court, so it has no legal meaning at this point. But it's a significant list of specific charges based on evidence that the U.S. Attorney's Office under Meg Curran was willing to go to court or might have gone to court with. So this is significant. we ought to all take it seriously. I don't believe that Buddy Cianci knows any other way but pay to play.
And let me add just one final comment about who is here with us today and who's not. Obviously, anyone who is still currently engaged in law enforcement or working in a prosecutor's office is not in a position to make a public comment of the type that we're making here today. And the other obvious figure who was very much involved in the Cianci prosecution was Meg Curran, who served as the U.S. Attorney in between Sheldon's tenure and mine. Meg, as many of you know, is currently serving as the head of the PUC. That position is a quasi-judicial position which requires Meg to, from time to time, decide cases and decide issues, and sometimes the city of Providence may have an interest in some of those cases. So she believes, and I think rightly, that under the circumstances, she cannot participate in this commentary either. Having said that, anyone who has been around and been reading the papers for the last 15 years knows full well exactly what Meg's position is on all this and how she feels about the nature of Mr. Cianci's performance while in office. So that I hope will clear up the mystery of why Meg is not with us here today.
Bob, is it difficult to come and do this today?
No, it's not difficult to do, because I don't really see this as a partisan issue or as really even as a political issue. I see this as an educational opportunity to speak to some people who might not be as familiar as others with the whole investigation and what went on. And it's critically important for anyone who has to make a decision about whether Mr. Cianci is the right person to lead the city.
Are you doing
What's
this?
difficult, Steve, is to have to do this.
Bob, what's your explanation for why Cianci has the level of support that he has? He was the front runner in a recent Providence Criminal Challenge poll. What's your explanation for that?
I think as several people in this room have noted before in other writings, obviously he's an energetic guy, he's a witty guy, he's charismatic, he's all of those things. That doesn't address the question of whether he served with the kind of integrity that is necessary to handle either the mayor's job or any serious job in the public sector.
I'd like to add to that in the sense that even during his trial, the Brown poll showed that a substantial majority of people were saying that he was doing a good job, even while a substantial majority was saying that they believed he was dishonest. Those are important realities, but you can fool some of the people some of the time.
Where was Governor Almond speaking to us from?
His home.
In
Hello?
Yes, what is the question?
Question is, where was Governor Almond speaking to us from? And I said from his home.
Okay.
in which town?
Okay.
Senator, are you worried that Buddy Cianci is going to win in November?
No, they just want to know where you were speaking from. Okay. You want to answer that? Hold on a second.
He said my house.
I'm in Kingston. Thank you.
I didn't let that answer come first. If that weren't a plausible concern, then we would not be here.
Can you repeat
But
the
I'm
question, please?
confident that the voters of Providence will have the good judgment not to put their city back under the control of someone with this kind of a record.
I understand, but could you make it clear, are you worried that he's going to win? This is extraordinary that you're here and Governor Almond's on the phone. There must be some real concern, some real fear that he's going to win.
I think it's a plausible enough prospect that we felt it incumbent upon us to take this step. But as I said, I am confident that the voters of Providence will think long and hard before they put their city back under the control of a man with this kind of a record.
Thousands of your neighbors, thousands of your constituents are willing to ignore everything you just laid out and possibly vote for this man. Are we all out of touch? Is there a disconnect? What would you say to those people?
I think there's a disconnect between people who enjoy the entertainment value of Mr. Cianci and those who have been the subject of or privy to his criminal efforts. And we wanted to emphasize the latter. He's obviously quite an entertainer, but underneath that, as Judge Torres said, they're the two buddies. We want to make sure people remember you get both when you elect him.
You know, he was just on Hardball, and Cianci was, and they asked him about the convictions, and he said, you know, oh yeah, they got me on the RICO charge, not the underlying ones. Let's move on. So how do you address that he was found not convicted of the others?
One of the jurors said very clearly, and it's quoted in the Providence Journal, that it wasn't that they believed that he was innocent, it was that they didn't see enough direct connection to find him guilty. And there's a difference. It's a high standard to find someone guilty, and yet the evidence is there that he's deeply involved.
And, you know, to respond to that, Ed, if you read the Court of Appeals opinion, they make it abundantly clear that there was a great deal of evidence, as I mentioned, that placed Mr. Cianci
Could you not talk into the phone, please?
at the very center of what was going on, and that the schemes that were being perpetrated were being done so in order to line his pockets. The Court of Appeals also addressed the issue legally of whether it's possible to convict on the overarching conspiracy and not the underlying predicate acts. And they said, by all means, it's permissible to do so. That's the law, because the jury is allowed, whether as a compromise verdict or for whatever other reason, to say, yes, we think he was running this whole thing as a conspiracy, and if they don't want to convict on the separate underlying counts, they don't have to do that. It's perfectly fine. That's the law.
Is it his refusal to acknowledge or admit his guilt in this that leads you to say that he can't have been rehabilitated during his 5 years in prison?
I wanted to correct the misimpression that this was minimal conduct, or that it was a unique episode. As I said, the evidence predating the investigation that gave rise to the predication to start the investigation is an important signal of the longevity of his misconduct, and the 404B filing that the office subsequently made is another indication, which now been made public, and those are two pretty hard and fast facts that put, I think, a more accurate description out of exactly what his tenure was like.
I think Cianci's inevitably going to release a statement saying that you guys are just trying to, pile on and not letting the good people of Providence decide and see it now. What do you guys say about that?
I want the good people of Providence to decide, but I want it to be an informed decision. And because of the positions that Governor Almond and I and Bob Correnti have had as U.S. attorneys, we have a particular perspective on that, but I think ought to facilitate the voters in making that decision.
I have a question about going forward. We talk a lot about what has happened in the past, but I'm interested in going forward. You talk about the businessmen who had to pay bribes. What about other law enforcement working with the Providence Police, knowing that he is heading the Providence Police? What about obtaining federal grants from a person who is heading a city hall that was using the money for these reasons? Is Providence setting itself up?
It's a whole different topic, the subject of the Providence Police under Mayor Cianci. There were law enforcement matters that the Providence Police was kept out of because of concerns about corruption, and the stories of the impound lot, the disappearing and magically reappearing kilo of cocaine, and other misbehavior with evidence has all been documented. I think the Providence Police has worked very hard in the intervening years to bring itself back. I'm enormously proud of what they have done. I'm enormously proud of and confident in Chief Clements. But I do think it would be an additional cloud over them if we were to go back to that kind of management and oversight of the police department by the political side of the mayor's office.
Senator,
What
just
about
a-
money though? What about the federal
To
grants?
address the second part of that, there are so many different ways in which a third Cianci administration could have negative effects on the city, not only from the issuance of grants, but just the response in the business community to what would surely be a national story. This guy getting back into office. As Senator Whitehouse mentioned, there is a direct tie between the kinds of money that get invested in any particular town or city and the perception, regionally, locally, and nationally, about whether that money is being well spent. And people, frankly, don't want to spend their money in a town where part of the money is going to pay bribes and kickbacks. That's not a good use of anybody's money. So there are multiple layers of economic effect that the city would be subject to were this to come to pass.
Senator, I guess just to follow up on Amanda's question too, I mean, let's say he is elected, is it difficult for you in Washington to, lobby for money to come back to Providence, knowing that Buddy Cianci is the mayor?
It's part of my job to advocate for Rhode Island and for our communities. Grant makers will be putting Rhode Island against other states, and will be putting Rhode Island cities and towns against other municipalities. And I would very much doubt that the return of this particular shadow would do our applications any good.
Attorney Correnti, the senator mentioned that some of the Cianci supporters are being entertained. Clearly, the police and firefighters, the teachers union, the taxi cab drivers union, some laborers unions are looking for a little more than entertainment.
Sure.
What would you say directly to them?
Well, look, I mean, part of what I think Phil West alluded to was some of the problems that were created under prior administration. And it's no secret that some of the most outrageous contracts that the city has been saddled with were contracts that were handed out in the prior Cianci administrations. So clearly, when it comes time for the unions to decide who they're going to endorse, they have their own economic issues to consider, to deal with. But particularly a union as critical as the police union, that puts the city in a very, very delicate position where they're voting their economic interest, obviously, and supporting him, while at the same time subjecting themselves to the indirect leadership of somebody who's got a very, very checkered past.
Are those selfish self-concerns that the police union has?
Are they what?
Is the word, would you use the word selfish in
No.
describing the police union?
No, I wouldn't call it selfish. I mean, obviously, their union is going to, like any other union or any other entity, is going to look out for what they perceive to be in their best interest. I'm just saying it creates a very, very difficult situation.
Meeting Wednesday, coming up at 9, folks, the latest campaign, getting a job.
I think that's a sign of we're out of time. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.